Please, Mum. I cannot marry who I don't love.
You don't have a choice anyway. You are adopted.
The wedding day was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, but it was the worst. As Alyssa walked down the aisle, her heart wasn't filled with excitement or love. It was filled with dread. The people staring at her, the family who had forced her into this marriage, had no idea of the truth. They thought they had trapped her. But what they didn't know was that her husband was no ordinary man. Alyssa had always felt different from her adoptive family. She was a quiet girl, reserved but smart, trying her best to blend in. But no matter how hard she tried, it seemed like her family never fully accepted her. She was adopted when she was 4 years old after her biological parents died in a tragic car accident. Alyssa's adoptive parents were slightly kind, but it was the 3 older sisters that made her feel like an outsider. The eldest sister, Jessica, was the first to make sure Alyssa knew her place. Jessica was beautiful and confident, always with a sharp word for Alyssa when no one else was listening. "You're not one of us, Alyssa," she would say, her eyes cold. "You don't belong here. You never will." She would often look at Alyssa with a sneer, as though she were nothing more than a burden. The middle sister, Michelle, wasn't much better. She was sharp-tongued, quick to make jokes at Alyssa's expense. Michelle's favorite pastime was picking at Alyssa's appearance. "You really think you'll ever be pretty enough to fit in with us? Look at your clothes. They're so outdated." Michelle was the type of person who would put a smile on her face when someone else was around, but would turn into a completely different person behind closed doors. Alyssa would sometimes catch Michelle rolling her eyes when their mother was busy with something else, and it felt like a constant reminder that she wasn't truly one of them. Then there was Emily, the youngest. Emily was quieter than her 2 older sisters, but her silence was just as hurtful. While Jessica and Michelle were openly cruel, Emily's silent treatment was more cutting. She would give Alyssa these cold, disapproving looks, as if she blamed Alyssa for the family's troubles. Emily wasn't outwardly mean, but she didn't need to be. Her coldness spoke volumes. As the years passed, Alyssa learned to live with the subtle but constant reminders that she wasn't part of the family. She always felt like an outsider, even though her adoptive parents tried to include her. She couldn't help but notice how the 3 sisters would go out together without her, share inside jokes that made her feel invisible, and always act like she was a guest in their home, not a daughter. It wasn't that her adoptive parents loved her. They didn't, but at least they pretended to. They provided a roof over her head, food on the table, and gave her little to no education. But deep down, Alyssa could sense that their love for her was different from the love they had for their biological children. The way they looked at her was always tinged with a bit of annoyance, as if they were doing her a favor by raising her. They never explicitly said it, but the way they talked about her biological parents and referred to her as the adopted one made it clear that she was never fully accepted as a true member of the family. Alyssa had always longed to belong somewhere, to feel that sense of family that others seemed to have naturally, but no matter what she did, it felt like she was always falling short. She couldn't help but compare herself to her sisters. They all had their own friends, their own activities, and their own lives. Meanwhile, Alyssa felt like she was constantly trying to catch up, trying to be someone she wasn't. Her adoptive mother, always nonchalant, was not immune to the subtle biases that crept into the way she treated Alyssa. She would often comment on Alyssa's manners or appearance, comparing her to Jessica, who was always so poised, or Michelle, who was always so outgoing. "If only you would try a little harder, Alyssa," her mother would say, as if there was something she needed to prove to be worthy of love. The emotional toll of living in a family where she didn't feel accepted was wearing on Alyssa. She had learned to smile and nod when her sisters mocked her, but inside, it hurt. She tried to be like them, to act like them, to think like them, but no matter how hard she tried, it never worked. She could never fully escape the feeling that she was different. Her adoptive father, a quiet and gentle man, didn't treat her any differently from his biological daughters, but he was distant. It was clear that he didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. He never really spoke about her adoption, and it was almost as though the subject was too uncomfortable for him to address. As Alyssa entered her late teens, the pressure from her family to find someone to marry became constant. Her sisters were all paired off with respectable young men from good families. Alyssa, on the other hand, didn't have a boyfriend. She wasn't the type to go out and meet new people, especially when her sisters were always with their friends. She felt like the odd one out, again. One day during dinner, her adoptive mother brought up the subject of marriage. "You're getting older, Alyssa," she said, glancing at her husband. "It's time to start thinking about your future." Jessica smirked. "You should find someone soon, otherwise you'll be left behind. You don't want to be the only one without a man, do you?" Michelle chuckled. "Don't worry, Alyssa. I'm sure there's a guy out there who'll take you. You don't need to be pretty to get married, just useful. Plus, you'll stop being a freeloader." The comments made Alyssa want to shrink into her seat. Her sisters had never been kind, but their words stung more than ever now. Later that evening, her mother sat down with her hands gripping Alyssa's ear. "Listen very carefully to what I am about to say. We've been thinking about a man we know," she said. "He's not rich, but he's hardworking. His name is Tom, and he works as a mechanic. He could be a good match for you, at least would carry the burden of fending for an extra mouth," she said, rolling her eyes, feeling irritably satisfied. Her words ironically meant that Alyssa, the adopted one, was their burden all along. Alyssa's heart sank. She knew what this meant. Her mother didn't care about her happiness. She cared about making sure Alyssa married someone who wouldn't be a disappointment. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about chemistry. It was about practicality. "I don't know, Mom," Alyssa replied quietly. "I don't think I'm ready to settle down with someone I don't know. Someone I don't know if I can love or not." "You'll be fine," her mother replied coldly. "He's a good, reliable man. That's what you need, Alyssa. That's enough." Alyssa wanted to argue, to tell her mother that she didn't want to marry a stranger, especially someone who worked as a mechanic, but she knew better than to protest. Her mother had already made up her mind, and there was no room for discussion. As the days went by, Alyssa found herself dreading the thought of meeting Tom. She had never considered marriage to be something she could take lightly, but now here she was, being pushed into a marriage with a man she didn't even know, just because her family thought it was the right thing to do. And so the idea of Tom loomed over Alyssa like a shadow she couldn't escape. She didn't know anything about him, except that he was poor and that her family didn't think he was good enough for her. But what could she do? She had no choice. Little did she know, this forced marriage would turn out to be the beginning of a journey that would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. Alyssa's heart felt heavy as the day of her wedding approached. She had always dreamed of a grand, magical wedding, a celebration where she felt loved, admired, and important. But this wedding was nothing like that. Instead of excitement, she felt a deep sense of dread. The man she was about to marry, Tom, was practically a stranger. Her mother had arranged it all as usual without consulting her. Alyssa was left with little choice but to go along with it, just as she had done with every decision her adoptive family had made for her life. She had always been the quiet, obedient daughter, the one who never argued or pushed back, and now she was about to marry a man she didn't know, someone she had barely met. Her adoptive mother was gushing with excitement, clearly more invested in the wedding than Alyssa was. "He's such a good man, Alyssa. I can already tell. He's hardworking and dependable, and that's all you need. You'll be just fine." Alyssa had never felt more alone than when her mother said those words. She wanted to scream that it wasn't enough. Love was supposed to be the foundation of a marriage, not just practicality and security. But her mother didn't understand that. To her, security was everything, and so Alyssa kept quiet, trying not to think too hard about the fact that her future was being decided for her. The day of the wedding, Alyssa stood in front of the mirror, staring at her reflection. The white dress felt heavy on her, not because of its weight, but because it symbolized everything she had been forced into. The dress was beautiful, yes, but it didn't hold the joy she had imagined as a child. Instead, it felt like a shackle, a symbol of everything she had lost in the process. As the wedding ceremony began, Alyssa could hear the murmurs of her adoptive family sitting in the front row, all of them wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes. They were excited, sure, but it wasn't for her. It was for themselves, for the image they wanted to present to the world. Alyssa could feel the tension in the air, the undercurrent of judgment from her three sisters, who had made it clear how they felt about her marriage. Jessica, the eldest, looked at Alyssa with a smirk on her face as she whispered to Michelle, "Can you believe this? She's actually marrying him. Look at his clothes, he's barely fit to be here." Michelle chuckled softly. "She should be grateful. He's all she's going to get. Look at her, she has no choice." Alyssa's heart sank at their words, but she didn't have the courage to look at them. Instead, her eyes focused on Tom, who stood nervously at the altar, looking as uncomfortable as she felt. His suit was worn, old, and torn in places. It wasn't a bad suit, just frayed from years of use. His shoes were scuffed, his hair slightly unkempt, and his hands were shaking as he held them in front of him. He looked nothing like what Alyssa had imagined a husband would look like. There were no grand gestures, no sparkling ring, no charming smile. He was simply there. Her family's disapproval was almost palpable, especially from her sisters. Jessica's mocking gaze, Michelle's condescending comments, and even Emily's cold silence made Alyssa feel like she was doing something terribly wrong. They all thought Tom was beneath her, a man who didn't deserve her. To them, the fact that he wasn't rich, that he didn't have a polished suit or a shiny car, was proof that he was a failure. But Alyssa couldn't help but notice how gentle Tom was with her. As the ceremony began, he looked into her eyes and gave her a small, reassuring smile. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't perfect, but in that moment, Alyssa saw a glimmer of kindness in him. His eyes, though nervous, were filled with sincerity. It was clear he didn't want this wedding to be a burden for her. The vows came and went, and soon they were married. Alyssa stood there, holding Tom's hand, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. There was no love in her heart, not for him, not for the situation. There was only an overwhelming sense of obligation. As the ceremony ended and they walked down the aisle, Alyssa's mind was racing. Was this her life now? Was she really going to spend the rest of her days with a man she barely knew, all because her family had insisted on it? She wanted to cry, to scream that she wasn't ready for this, but she kept it inside. She had no voice in this matter. This was her reality, and she had no choice but to accept it. That night, as they entered their small, modest apartment, a far cry from the grand home she had imagined for herself, Alyssa looked around the space with a sinking feeling. It was simple. There was no luxury, no extravagance. The furniture was basic, the walls bare. The apartment felt cold and empty, just like she felt inside. Tom, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease. He smiled as he set down their bags, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. "This is our new home," he said with a quiet pride. Alyssa didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say. This wasn't the future she had pictured for herself. She had never imagined being in a small apartment like this, married to a man who was still struggling to make ends meet. The thought of spending her days like this felt suffocating. But then Tom turned to her, his expression soft. "Alyssa, I know this isn't how you imagine things. It's not how I imagined it either, but we'll make it work. We'll build a life together, no matter how small it starts." His words were gentle, and for the first time, Alyssa felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Hope. He wasn't asking her to settle for less. He was asking her to build something with him. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't glamorous, but there was sincerity in his voice, something real that she couldn't deny. For the first time that day, Alyssa took a deep breath and allowed herself to imagine a future where things were different. Maybe she didn't know Tom well yet, but maybe, just maybe, this could work. It was a small hope, but it was there. Amidst her fears and worries, Tom didn't make her feel scared one bit. That evening, Tom went into the kitchen and prepared a delicious meal for them. The scent of a spicy, well-cooked jollof rice and chicken welcomed Alyssa even more. "He can cook," she thought to herself, looking surprised. He dished out the meal and offered Alyssa her own portion. As she devoured each spoon, she started thinking towards the positive side of their marriage. Little by little, her uneasiness began to disappear. As the evening wore on and they settled into their new home, Alyssa sat beside Tom on the couch. They talked, mostly about trivial things, the weather, their day, how they would arrange the furniture. But beneath the small talk, Alyssa could sense something deeper. Tom wanted to make this work. He wasn't forcing her into anything. He wasn't trying to control her life. He was just trying to make the best of a situation that neither of them had chosen. And for the first time in a long while, Alyssa felt a tiny spark of peace. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. But that was before she learned the truth, before she discovered who Tom really was. The first few weeks of Alyssa and Tom's marriage were uncomfortable, but not in the way she had expected. Alyssa had imagined it would be difficult to share a home with someone she barely knew, but Tom was surprisingly kind and considerate. Despite the small, humble apartment, he did everything he could to make her feel welcome. He would often surprise her with little acts of thoughtfulness, bringing home her favorite snacks, taking care of the household chores without being asked, and always making sure she felt comfortable. Alyssa, though still unsure about the situation, started to appreciate the simple, quiet life they were building together. It wasn't the grand life her family had always wanted for her, but there was a peace in their routine that she hadn't expected. Tom would get up early every morning, heading to his small mechanic shop just down the street. He was a hard worker, and even though his clothes were worn and his suit was practically falling apart, he never complained. Alyssa often watched him leave in the morning, seeing the way he walked with determination, despite the tiredness in his eyes. As the days went by, Alyssa began to settle into the rhythm of their life. She would work her shifts at the local store while Tom spent long hours at the shop. Though their apartment was far from luxurious, it felt like home, more than Alyssa had ever felt before. But there was always the nagging feeling that something wasn't right, something she didn't know about Tom. He never talked much about his past. He was always focused on the present, on making things work with her. But Alyssa couldn't shake the curiosity that gnawed at her. One evening, as Alyssa was cleaning up after dinner, Tom was sitting at the kitchen table, fiddling with a piece of paper. It was an envelope, and Alyssa couldn't help but notice the gold lettering on the front, the kind of fine print that came with important documents. She tried to ignore it at first, but her curiosity got the better of her. "Tom, what's that?" Alyssa asked, trying to sound casual. Tom looked up at her, his expression shifting slightly. For a moment, there was a hesitation in his eyes before he quickly tucked the envelope away. "Oh, nothing. Just some paperwork for the shop." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. He had never been secretive with her before, and his reaction seemed off, but she didn't press him. Instead, she continued cleaning, though her mind was now racing with questions. What was he hiding? Why had he reacted so strangely? That night, as she lay in bed, the question lingered. Alyssa couldn't help but feel like there was something more to Tom than the man she saw every day. He wasn't just a humble mechanic. But why wouldn't he tell her? Was he ashamed of something? Or was it something else altogether? Days passed, and Alyssa's suspicions grew. She started noticing small things, details that didn't add up. Tom was always kind and helpful, but he seemed to know more than a typical mechanic should. Sometimes, when they walked through the city, he would point out buildings or shops with a knowledge that surprised her. And then there were the occasional glimpses of a different side of him, an almost imperceptible tension in his posture when people mentioned wealth, or the way he would avoid talking about his past. It was as if he was hiding something important. Finally, Alyssa couldn't stand it anymore. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, watching TV in the quiet of their small apartment, she decided to ask him directly. Her heart raced as she turned to him. "Tom, I need to ask you something," Alyssa began, her voice shaky. "You've been acting strange lately. There's something you're not telling me, and I think I have the right to know. What is it?" Tom looked at her, his expression softening. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Alyssa felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't want to push him, but her curiosity was eating away at her. "Alyssa," Tom began, his voice low, "I didn't want to tell you this, not because I don't trust you, but because I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have. You're right. There's something I've been hiding." Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked softly. Tom took a deep breath, and for the first time, Alyssa saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm not just a mechanic." Thanks for watching. Please subscribe to my channel for more.